It began with a scream, a long, piercing, gut-wrenching wail that sliced through the stillness of the early morning like an air raid siren. I jolted upright in bed, my heart hammering against my ribcage, certain that disaster had struck. A break-in? A fire? A rabid animal on the loose? But no, it was just Linda again. Groggy and exasperated, I stumbled to the window and parted the blinds. There she was, thrashing around my backyard in her garish polka-dot robe, shrieking at the top of her lungs. My garden, my sanctuary, my pride, was now a battlefield. Crushed flowers, broken tomato vines, and trampled herbs lay in ruins. And there, at the epicenter of the chaos, stood Linda, clutching one of my prized eggplants like a blunt instrument, her face contorted with self-righteous fury. "You," she bellowed, thrusting the vegetable toward me like an accusation. "How dare you put these plants in my way?" It took me a moment to register the sheer lunacy of her statement. I dragged a hand across my face, already drained. "Linda, it's my garden. In my yard." She stomped her foot, crushing what was left of my time. "It's my shortcut. You can't just plant obstacles in my shortcut." There it was, the same absurd argument she'd been peddling for weeks. Linda had crowned herself the neighborhood's supreme overlord and unilaterally declared my backyard a public thoroughfare to the street behind our homes. I tried asking her politely to stop. I'd even put up a friendly little sign. Nothing worked. She kept barreling through my garden like a tornado, and now, standing amidst the wreckage she'd caused, she had the gall to be mad at me. "You need to move your plants," she announced, as if she held dominion over my property. "This is an inconvenience." "Inconvenience." My voice cracked. "Linda, you murdered my rosemary." She rolled her eyes. "They're just plants." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to keep it together. I wasn't going to lose it over this. I refused to become the unhinged neighbor ranting about greenery. But Linda knew how to push every last button I had. "Linda," I said, clinging to the last thread of my patience, "there's a perfectly good sidewalk in front of your house." "That adds 4 whole minutes to my walk," she snapped, planting her hands on her hips. "I don't have time for that." I blinked at her. "You're retired." She gasped as if I'd just spat on her grandmother's grave. "That doesn't mean I have time to waste." That was the moment I realized logic was a foreign language to Linda. This wasn't a debate grounded in reason. It was a declaration of war. The first skirmish unfolded through the homeowners association. I filed a detailed complaint, outlining her relentless trespassing and the carnage she'd inflicted on my property. But Linda, the conniving busybody she was, had her claws deep in the HOA. She'd been on the board for years, her influence a tangled web. A week later, I got a response, not a reprimand for Linda, but a notice aimed at me. It accused me of hostile behavior toward a fellow resident. Hostile behavior? For asking someone to stop annihilating my plants? I was furious. I marched to the HOA office, only to find Linda already there, hamming it up as the victim. "He's been so aggressive," she whimpered, dabbing at bone-dry eyes with a tissue from Maximum Theater. "I just want to live in peace, but he keeps harassing me." The HOA president, a weary man who looked like he'd checked out of life decades ago, sighed. "Sir, you need to be more neighborly." Neighborly? I nearly choked. "She's trespassing." Now, he said, waving a dismissive hand. "It's just a garden. No need to blow this out of proportion." I wanted to scream. Linda flashed a smug, feline grin, like a cat who'd just swatted a vase off a shelf. That night, as I surveyed the devastation in my garden, it hit me. I'd been playing nice, following the rules, while Linda operated in a lawless realm of her own making. If I wanted to win, I had to fight fire with fire. The breaking point came when I caught her in the act again. I'd installed a motion sensor camera after the HOA debacle, and the footage was damning. There she was, sauntering through my yard at dawn, stomping my petunias like they'd personally offended her. She even stopped to pluck a few peppers, stuffing them into her cavernous handbag. That was it. Diplomacy had failed. The law had failed. It was time for something unconventional. I spent the next week plotting meticulously. At the local nursery, I picked up some unassuming new additions, poison ivy. Planting it in my own yard wasn't illegal. It's just a plant, after all, albeit a particularly vengeful one. I wove it carefully along Linda's beloved shortcut, blending it with the surrounding foliage. To the untrained eye, it was just another bush. To anyone dumb enough to charge through it, it was a reckoning. The night before I finalized my trap, I stood in my yard, admiring my handiwork. Was I proud of stooping to this level? Maybe a little. The next morning, I wasn't woken by my alarm, but by a symphony of pure torment. Yeah, help! I leapt out of bed, barely containing my delight, and dashed to the window. Linda was back in my yard, but this time she wasn't stomping, she was scratching. Her arms and legs were a patchwork of furious red welts, and she clawed at her skin like a woman unhinged. She tripped over a hose and landed hard on her backside. "What did you do?" she howled, her face a blend of rage and desperation. I stepped onto my porch, feigning worry. "Linda, you don't look so good." She jabbed a trembling finger at me. You put something in my shortcut." "My yard," I corrected. "And what do you mean? Those are just some native plants. I thought you didn't care about plants." Her mouth flapped open and shut, her brain short-circuiting from fury and what I hoped was an unbearable itch. "I'm calling the HOA." "And the police," she screeched, still raking at her arms. I folded my arms. "On what grounds?" "For walking through my private property." Her eyes bulged. She had no comeback, no leverage, just raw, seething anger and a whole lot of misery. As she stormed off, still scratching like a lunatic, I let out a long, contented sigh. Linda had spent months wrecking my garden. Now my garden had struck back. And this was just the beginning. Her scream lingered in my ears long after she'd retreated to her house, clawing at herself like a dog with fleas. I settled onto my porch with my coffee, watching her pace her backyard, ranting into her phone. Fragments of her tirade floated over: lawsuit, criminal, emergency removal, each word a testament to her unraveling. I sipped my coffee, relishing the triumph. The garden had landed a solid blow. Later that afternoon, a pest control van rolled up to Linda's place. I nearly spat out my drink as she emerged, still blotchy and scratching, marching toward the poor technician like a general on a mission. "There are dangerous plants all over that yard," she barked, flailing her arms toward my garden. "They're toxic, illegal, and they need to go now." The guy, clearly underpaid for this level of drama, ambled over to inspect my plants. He crouched, studied the leaves, then turned back to Linda with a bored look. "Ma'am, this is just poison ivy." Her face twisted like she'd been slapped. "Just poison ivy? Do you have any idea what I've endured?" She thrust a rash-covered arm in his face. "This is a crime." He planted it to attack me. The technician scratched his neck, visibly desperate to escape. "Well, ma'am, poison ivy's a native plant, and this is his yard. He can grow whatever he wants." Linda's jaw dropped. "So you're saying I just have to live with this man-made death trap next door?" He shrugged. "Yeah, unless you stop walking through his yard." I could have hugged the guy. Linda let out a gasp of pure indignation, spun around, and stormed toward my porch. I barely had time to set down my mug before she was in my face, jabbing a finger at me. "You think this is funny?" she snarled. I weighed my options. Lie and say no? Fake remorse? Nah. I leaned back in my chair, stretched my arms behind my head, and smirked. Her eyes blazed. "You're going to remove every last one of those vile plants, or I'll sue," she spat. I raised an eyebrow. "Sue me for what?" "Gardening on my own land." She opened her mouth, then snapped it shut, grinding her teeth. "This isn't over," she hissed, before stomping off, her scratching growing more frantic with each step. I knew she wouldn't let it go. Linda didn't take losing well, even when it was her own doing. She'd lost this round, but I could see her plotting her next move. The next few days were unnervingly quiet. No yelling, no trampling, no theatrical gasps from my yard. But I knew Linda too well. Silence from her was more ominous than noise. 3 days later, I caught her peering over the fence, eyeing me like a predator. She held a clipboard, scribbling furiously. I groaned inwardly. Linda loved rules when they suited her, and now she was clearly hunting for some obscure regulation to force me to rip out the poison ivy. I caught her gaze, raised my coffee mug in a mock salute, and watched her nostrils flare. She scribbled harder and vanished. That evening, a knock interrupted my quiet night. I opened the door to a man in a cheap suit, clutching a bulging folder. He adjusted his glasses and launched into a rehearsed spiel. "Sir, I'm here on behalf of the Homeowners Association. A complaint has been filed about hazardous plants on your property. I rubbed my temples. Let me guess, Linda. He faltered. We, can't disclose that. I snorted. Right. So what's the complaint? He flipped through his papers. The plants are deemed a public safety hazard. I crossed my arms. They're in my yard. Yes, but they're creating an unsafe environment for, he paused, realizing how ridiculous he sounded. People who might accidentally come into contact with them. I stared at him. He stared back. A dog barked in the distance. So, I said, the HOA is saying my plants are unsafe, but only for someone trespassing? His mouth opened, then shut, then opened again. Well, I cut him off. Look, there's no rule against poison ivy. I checked. I'm not breaking any laws. So unless you've got proof otherwise, take your papers, go back to your car, and tell Linda she'll need a new shortcut. His face turned pink. He wasn't used to pushback. He shuffled through his folder one last time, sighed, and gave up. I'll inform the complainant. You do that, I said, waving cheerfully as he slunk away. I braced for Linda to come pounding on my door, ranting about injustice, but she didn't. Instead, I heard her muttering furiously from her porch, no doubt scheming. I almost pitied her. Almost. The next morning, her wails of misery woke me again. I stepped onto my porch just in time to see her on her front steps, covered in fresh poison ivy rashes, worse than before. She'd apparently been so obsessed with inspecting my yard that she'd blundered into more of it. Our eyes locked. For the first time, I saw something beyond rage, defeat. I gave her a friendly nod. Morning, Linda. Watch your step. She groaned and buried her face in her hands. I smiled. My garden had defended itself admirably, but I knew Linda wasn't finished. For the first time in ages, she went quiet. No shouting, no accusations, no rampaging through my yard like a crazed buffalo. Just silence. It should have felt like a win, but I wasn't naive enough to celebrate yet. Linda didn't surrender gracefully. She regrouped and retaliated. Her silence was the quiet before the storm. I didn't have to wait long. On a sunny Saturday morning, I stepped outside, coffee in hand, expecting to enjoy my peaceful garden. Instead, I found a nightmare. My yard, my beautiful, painstakingly tended garden, was gone. Flower beds were torn apart, vegetable plants uprooted and strewn across the lawn, bushes hacked into sad, lifeless stumps. My oasis was a wasteland of broken stems and scattered soil. At first, I thought a rogue animal was to blame. Then I saw the real culprit. A team of landscapers packing up their gear, and standing in the middle of it all, arms crossed and unbearably smug, was Linda. I barely noticed my coffee mug slipping from my hand and shattering on the porch. I stormed down the steps, pulse pounding. What the hell did you do? Linda turned with a sickeningly pleased smile. Oh, don't be so dramatic. I did you a favor. A favor? My voice broke. You destroyed my entire garden. She waved a hand. I had it removed. It was a public nuisance. I gaped at her, stunned by her nerve. A nuisance? In what universe was my garden a nuisance? Her grin widened. She'd been waiting for this. Oh, I got the HOA to approve it. Turns out, if something's deemed hazardous to the neighborhood, it can be forcibly removed. After all my complaints, they finally saw reason. The smugness in her tone made my blood boil. She'd gone behind my back, twisted the HOA's rules, and won. Rage surged through me, but I took a deep breath. Linda fed on emotional outbursts. She wanted me to snap so she could play the martyr again. I wasn't giving her that. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. You hired landscapers to tear up my yard without my permission. Her smile flickered. Well, yes, but it was necessary. I nodded, processing. And you paid for it, right? Since it was your idea? She lifted her chin. Of course. That was all I needed. I turned and marched back into my house, ignoring her taunts as she tried to provoke me. I had something better than a shouting match, evidence. I pulled up my security footage and rewound to that morning. There it was, clear as day, Linda directing the landscapers as they demolished my property. No contract, no notice, just her orchestrating blatant trespassing and vandalism. I was going to make her regret it. First, I sent the video to the HOA with a formal complaint, highlighting their hypocrisy in letting Linda destroy my yard while ignoring my earlier pleas. Their response was swift and panicked. They hadn't expected her to escalate this far. Fearing legal blowback, they backtracked hard, issuing an apology and reversing their ruling. Linda was ordered to pay for the damages plus a steep fine for unauthorized destruction. But I didn't stop there. I forwarded the footage to my lawyer, who confirmed I had a rock-solid case for trespassing and property damage. Then, for good measure, I dropped the video into the neighborhood group chat. Within hours, the community was buzzing. Linda had spent years crafting her image as the ideal neighbor, the HOA's unofficial queen. Now she was the villain who'd illegally trashed someone's yard out of spite. By morning, her front yard was littered with furious notes from neighbors fed up with her nonsense. The HOA fined her. She had to cover my losses, and her reputation was shredded. But the best part? The look of utter humiliation on her face when she handed me the check for the damages. She tried to save face, chin high as she thrust it into my hands. "You may have won this round, but this isn't over." I smirked. "Oh, Linda, it's over. And you lost." She stormed off, slamming her door so hard her tacky wreath fell off. I pocketed the check, savoring the sweet taste of victory. With the settlement money, I didn't just rebuild my garden, I upgraded it. I installed a tall, sturdy fence, ensuring Linda could never trespass again. I planted more flowers, more vegetables, more everything. And just to twist the knife, I added a small, subtle sign near the fence. "Caution, poison ivy nearby." Linda never stepped foot in my yard again. As I sat on my porch, sipping coffee and watching my new garden flourish, I realized something. I'd wasted so much energy fighting her, reasoning with her, trying to protect what I loved. But in the end, she'd been her own downfall. I didn't need to fight anymore. She'd lost the war all by herself. The garden had triumphed, and for the first time in ages, I had peace.